Hi. Thank you, Emily, for that lovely introduction and for helping put this together. It's such an honor. I won't go on about it, but I've been a fan of Sarah's work for many, many years, so it's such an honor to be doing this tonight. And Fiona and Graywolf always hold a position in my heart that's hard to describe. But anyway, I'm happy to be here. I thought that I would read a short section from the empathy exams that I don't think I've ever read out loud before, but it felt right for tonight because it's about Frida Kahlo and about her diary, which is probably one of the things we're going to be talking about. So it's called Ex Votos. Frida Kahlo wore plaster corsets for most of her life because her spine was too weak to support itself. She painted them naturally, covering them with pasted scraps of fabric and drawings of tigers, monkeys, plumed birds, a blood-red hammer and sickle, streetcars like the one whose handrail slammed through her body when she was 18 years old. The corsets remain to this day in her famous blue house, their embedded mirrors reflecting back our gazes, their collages bringing the whole world into stricture. In one, an open circle has been carved into the plaster like a skylight near the heart. Charles Baxter once found what he called, quote, the last appeal in a scene from Sherwood Anderson, a woman running naked in the rain, begging attention from an old, deaf man. Her body, he writes, her last semiotic appeal or vulnerability or precious secret. It's all of these things, but it will not be reduced to one meaning. Carries the burden of her longing and becomes the record of erasure. Frida's corsets hardened around unspeakable longing. They still frame an invisible woman, still naked in her want, still calling to deaf men in the rain. I find them beautiful. She would have given anything, perhaps, to have a body that rendered them irrelevant. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera were married on August 21st, 1929. She was 22, he was 43. She used to call the two of them pareja extraña del país del punto y la raya, strange couple from the land of dot and line. In her diary, she draws them as Nefertiti and her consort, Akhenaten. Akhenaten has a swollen heart and ribs like claws around his chest. He has testicles that look like a brain, a penis that looks like his lover's dangling breast. Below is written, born to them was a boy strange of face. Nefertiti carries in her arms the baby Frida couldn't have. We find Diego like a virus through the diary pages. Diego, nothing compares to your hands. The hollow of your armpits is my shelter. I have stolen you and I leave weeping. I'm just kidding. My Diego, mirror of the night. Once, he who sees the color, and beneath that of herself, she who wears the color. Sometimes just Diego, or Diego, beginning, Diego, builder, Diego, my father, my husband, my child. Today, Diego kissed me, she wrote once, then crossed it out. It was also in August, 24 years after her wedding, that Frida finally lost her leg. Withered by polio, fractured in 11 places by the streetcar crash, it succumbed to gangrene and was amputated. She died the next year, as if this loss, after so many others, was what she finally couldn't bear. She had forgiven her body so many betrayals, only to watch it taken from her in pieces. She was fitted with a wooden leg, but her drinking made balance tricky. Frida loved her doctors. She thanks them over and over again in her diary. Gracias al Dr. Ramon Perez, gracias al Dr. Glusker, gracias al Dr. Farrell, gracias al Dr. Polo. She thanks them for their integrity, their intelligence, their affection. She associates their science with the color green. Sadness is green as well, also tree leaves and the nation of Germany. She has an entire vocabulary of color. Brown is mole and leaves becoming earth. Bright yellow is for the undergarments of ghosts. Riding a bus at 18, Frida stood next to an artisan carrying a pouch of gold dust. When the streetcar hit them, his pouch was broken over by the force of the collision, and Frida's body, ruined on concrete, was covered in what the pouch held. Gold was sunlight on asphalt. Gold was the gleam of metal through an open wound. Magenta, on the other hand, was the color of blood. El más vivo y antiguo, Frida called it, the most alive, the oldest shade. He who sees the colors. Frida was the one who had to wear them. Frida kept a collection of ex-votos, paintings offered in thanks to saints. These small scenes show angels hovering over the infirm and the saved, their tiny bodies curled in prostrate postures of gratitude or suffering. Cursive captions offer summaries so brief they seem like gags clamped over the full stories. I was crushed by a horse. The horse was startled by a snake. Ex-votos are full of Frida's hope and her stubbornness. Hers was a body pulled almost gravitationally toward injury, but her paintings point ceaselessly at grace. Two facing pages of her diary show a pair of matching goblets, each bearing the face of a woman, full lips, broad nose, fixed eyes curling tears from their corners. One face is angry, purple and red, bruised and bleeding shades, captioned, "No me lloros." Don't cry for me, don't weep to me. The other face is alabaster pale with blushing stains on its cheeks. Si, te lloro. I cry for you, I weep to you, I leave weeping, I'm just kidding. Don't weep to me. The wounded one will not permit herself, and yet does.
Wow, that gold dust image is indelible. I am so thrilled to be doing this event with Leslie, whom I've admired, and Fiona, who I've been grateful to ever since they agreed to take me on at Graywolf. Thank you for coming. Thank you for planning, Emily et al. I'm going to read about 9 minutes from my book Ongoingness, and just quickly, if I had to describe it, I would say that it originated as a book about graphomania, the problem of graphomania, and as I wrote it, it became a book about what it feels like to suddenly no longer suffer from graphomania. I started keeping a diary 25 years ago. It's 800,000 words long. I didn't want to lose anything. That was my main problem. I couldn't face the end of a day without a record of everything that had ever happened. I wrote about myself so I wouldn't become paralyzed by rumination, so I could stop thinking about what had happened and be done with it. More than that, I wrote so I could say I was truly paying attention. Experience in itself wasn't enough. The diary was my defense against waking up at the end of my life and realizing I'd missed it. The trouble was that I failed to record so much. I'd write about a few moments, but the surrounding time, there was so much of it, so much apparent nothing that I ignored, that I treated as empty time between the memorable moments. Despite my continuous effort in public and private, in the middle of the night, and in moving vehicles, I knew I couldn't replicate my whole life in language. I knew that most of it would follow my body into oblivion. From the beginning, I knew the diary wasn't working, but I couldn't stop writing. I couldn't think of any other way to avoid getting lost in time. I tried to record each moment, but time isn't made of moments. It contains moments. There is more to it than moments. So I tried to pay close attention to what seemed like empty time. I made my writing students sit silently for 20, 30, 40 minutes. Then we all wrote about the almost nothing that had happened. I was always running between the classroom and the photocopier so that we could read right away about the almost nothing that had just happened. I wanted to comprehend my own position in time so I could use my evolving self as completely and as usefully as possible. I didn't want to go lurching around half awake, unaware of the work I owed the world, work I didn't want to live without doing. To write a diary is to make a series of choices about what to omit, what to forget. A memorable sandwich, an unmemorable flight of stairs, a memorable bit of conversation surrounded by chatter that no one records. Hypergraphia, the overwhelming urge to write. Graphomania, the obsessive impulse to write. Look up the famous cases if you're interested. Nothing about them ever helped me with my problem. I started keeping the diary in earnest when I started finding myself in moments that were too full. At an art opening in the late 80s, I held a plastic cup of wine and stood in front of a painting next to a friend I loved. It was all too much. I stayed partly contained in that moment until that night when I wrote down everything that had happened and everything I remembered thinking while it had happened and everything I thought while recording what I remembered had happened. It wasn't the first time I'd had to do that, but as I wrote about the art opening, I realized my self-documentation would have to become a daily or more than daily practice. Today was very full, but the problem isn't today. It's tomorrow. I'd be able to recover from today if it weren't for tomorrow. There should be extra days, buffer days, between the real days. If I allowed myself to drift through non-documented time for more than a day, I feared I'd be swept up, no longer able to remember the purpose of continuing. 25 years later, the practice is an essential component of my daily hygiene. I'd sooner go unbathed. I often prefer writers' diaries to their work written intentionally for publication. It's as if I want the information without the obstacles of style or form. But of course, all writing possesses style and form, and in good writing, they aren't obstacles. A friend said, I want to write sentences that seem as if no one wrote them. The goal being the creation of a pure delivery system without the distraction of a style. The goal being a form no one notices, the creation of what seems like pure feeling, not of what seems like a vehicle for that feeling. Language is pure experience, pure memory. I too wanted to achieve that impossible effect. During the first few years of my marriage, I was highly susceptible to the previous day. I was convinced the marriage would soon be over, but it wasn't over. The problem was my inability to experience it as ongoing. Another friend wrote, marriage isn't like having a boyfriend or girlfriend, but a little more so, any more than gold is helium, but a little more so. The inner shell of electrons fills, and then the next one goes into the next shell, changing everything. Marriage isn't a fixed experience, it's a continuous one. It changes form, but is still always there, a rivulet under a frozen stream. Now when I feel a break in the continuity of till death do us part, I think to myself, get back in the river. Then I became a mother. I began to inhabit time differently. It had something to do with mortality. I kept writing the diary, but my worry about the lost memories began to subside. Nursing an infant creates so much lost, empty time. Of the baby's nighttime feeds, I remember nothing. Of his daytime feeds, I remember almost nothing. It was a different nothing from the unrecorded nothing of the years before. This new nothing was absent of subjective experience. I was either asleep or almost asleep at all times. Day and night consisted of the input and output of milk, often in an emergency, but the emergencies all resembled each other. At dawn, I noticed a pile of tiny damp blankets and tiny damp clothes on the nursery floor, but I never remembered replacing the green shirt with the yellow one. In my experience, nursing is waiting. The mother becomes the background against which the baby lives, becomes time. I used to exist against the continuity of time. Then I became the baby's continuity, a background of ongoing time for him to live against. I was the warmth and milk that was always there for him, the agent of comfort that was always there for him. My body, my life, became the landscape of my son's life. I am no longer merely a thing living in the world. I am a world. Another friend wrote to ask all the desperate questions I used to ask before I became a mother. How old were you? How long were you married? How long did it take? I wrote back, one of the great solaces of my life is that I no longer need to wonder whether I'll have children. Since the baby was born, I still occasionally wonder whether I should have a baby, whether I should get married, whether I should move to this or that city I've already moved to, already left. All the large questions still float all about me, and in its sleep-deprived, dampened awareness of the present moment, my memory treats these past moments as if they're all still happening. I've never understood so clearly that linear time is a summary of actual time, of all time, of the forever that has always been happening. The best thing about time passing is the privilege of running out of it, of watching the wave of mortality break over me and everyone I know. No more time, no more potential. The privilege of ruling things out, finishing, knowing I'm finished, and knowing time will go on without me. Look at me, dancing my little dance for a few moments against the background of eternity. Thank you.
So that was a treat to listen to you both. At Graywolf, we've been building a list of non-fiction writers that seems to be growing on itself, and we started a while back, not necessarily knowing that's what we were doing, but with a book called Halls of Fame by John D'Agata. And one of my theories of publishing is what you do leads to more of what you do. So he sort of framed this phrase, the lyric essay, rather than the personal essay. And between lyric essay and personal essay, between those two poles, we've been doing quite a lot of publishing, and we started a non-fiction prize, which has been won by Anne de Montson and Eula Biss. And one of the favorite things I think I ever heard any writer say about Graywolf was when Leslie was saying, when she was working on empathy exams, her agent was suggesting a different form to the one that she was using, and Leslie said, no, this is how I want to do it, and it'll be all right because Graywolf will take it. You were almost like writing it towards Graywolf. And then it's been fun over the last few months to take on some more writers in this genre, and we got news, well, maybe Sarah Manguso would come to Graywolf, and she did, and here we are celebrating your book. And there seems to be not a coincidence in the fact that you both are up there completely enjoying each other's work. So in reference to or token to the fact that tonight was billed as the insiders at Graywolf, I thought we'd have a little start with this Graywolf moment and just ask you both kind of what that means to you to be on the same list, or how you see the Graywolf nonfiction, or...
Well, I want at least partial credit for bringing Maggie Nelson to Graywolf. Yeah. It was a very long thought. Pardon me?
Say about that, because it's coming. Tell them about Maggie.
Oh, okay. Well, I was aware of John D'Agata from the very beginning. He was the rock star of my MFA class, and And he did. I mean, he actually did coin the phrase lyric essay, which is now so totally ensconced in the conversation about genre and the conversation about literature. It was just an idea that he had. And so was that really the first nonfiction book or the first sort of essayistic book like that? Wow, that's fantastic. Well, I mean, it only makes sense that it should have served as a magnet for all of these other great essayists. I went to Graywolf because my editor, Ethan Nazowski, sent me an email a kind of email that I really had never received before. It was an email from somebody who had been reading me for 20 years, like before I was actually really anything, like before I was like a molecule of a writer. And he had considered everything just with equal thoughtfulness and with equal care, and he had an idea of how I could possibly make this very short piece of writing into a book. And I mean, there was nothing to do except to sort of fall in line, and I'm very, very lucky that I did.
Yeah, well, my voice is so loud in my own ears. I feel, I mean, the Graywolf, I was thrilled to become part of the Graywolf list, and it's actually been a deepening pleasure because the list has come to include writers that I've admired for so long, and so I feel even more like I belong in Graywolf than I did when I first started out. That, I mean, the story you told, I'm not sure that I had such total, utter confidence that Graywolf would take the book, but I very much hoped. I felt like, having read Notes from No Man's Land and some of the other winners of the prize, I felt, even if I didn't feel sure that Graywolf would take my book, I did realize that Graywolf was a home for a kind of nonfiction that wasn't easily categorized in some of the sort of segmented sections that can dominate certain parts of the marketplace, like, this is memoir or this is criticism or something like that. It seemed like Graywolf was very open to the ways that those categories always seemed to me very porous. Like in my head, the ways that I experience books and the way that I experience my own life and the way that I experience what it means to travel to another place, it's not like those happen in separate countries. Like they're all happening inside me, and I felt like when I read Graywolf books, they honored that interconnectedness in this way. They made it feel like, well, if it was going to have a home anywhere, it would be with these people and these writers. So
it's been a good year because it felt like Eula Biss, in a certain way, created a space for us even to understand empathy exams and publishing it. And then we published empathy exams the same year that we published the second book by Eula Biss, and then empathy exams created a place for Eula Biss, and then we could say to Sarah, and look, we published Leslie and Eula, you belong here. So it's just been a very gratifying thing. And Maggie Nelson's book's coming, Argonauts, about queer family making as a shorthand, and then there's another book coming down the line by Belle Boggs talking about her attempts to get pregnant and how she feels about her changing ideas about motherhood and whether or not even her characters in fiction had children. So it's something that we all feel that we're learning and growing from at Graywolf. So publishing is very public and you very much have an audience in mind, but diary writing is very private. Or you say, Sarah says in her book, she doesn't actually mind if someone reads her diary. She doesn't look it up, has never looked it up. However, you even read that piece about form being an obstacle. So I was just wondering about both of you. I mean, Leslie, do you keep a diary, and how you both feel about audience and form questions?
I do keep a diary.
I thought so.
Sometimes, I mean, some portions of my life I've kept it more than others. And the question of audience is interesting. I think sometimes it's hard for me to answer in a pure way whether I think I write the diary for anyone. I think sometimes I'm writing for a future self, like for future version of myself. Like that's the easiest, most intuitive answer I could give. And in certain ways, like I'm also this is the kind of stuff that's like really embarrassing to admit, but I sometimes reread my own diaries from years before, and I think that reading my diaries has changed the way that I write it, because I've, for example, like used to write entries that were very abstract and emotional. Like this is how I'm feeling about this thing, and I started to find that very unsatisfying as a reader. Like I would want to know, like, well, what happened, and like where were you, and like what did you eat? Like I just wanted particulars, but the particulars are never what you want to write in the moment, because the particulars are already with you. So I think I started to put down more of the things of what I lived, because I realized that was what was going to bring me back into that moment if I was reading it later. But all that just sounds like a sort of kind of a solipsistic closed circuit. But I think some of that is happening in my mind. But
now, much to respond to. The first thing I must say is that, of course, you reread your diary. There's a whole portion in the middle of my book where I say. Or I guess I confess that I revise my diary, I revise it over and over with great care, and I don't really intend it to be written for an audience. I say it's written for an audience of 0, and because I'm not the audience. Although I liked what you said about your future self being the audience, and you kind of have to wait for her to read it. But it makes utter sense, especially if you're a writer, to want to go back and reread it and reconsider it. And in my case, there was a time that I decided I needed to read 1995 and 1996 over again, and 1996 was so boring I just threw it away, which seems kind of insane to me at the moment, but I know it was just very reasonable as I was doing it. There was something else you said though. The idea that somebody should read it not being of vast concern to me. It's not that I sort of coyly say like, well, I don't care if you read it, but I've just observed myself over the past 25 years. I don't hide it. I don't when it was on a paper book. I didn't hide it. I read it on my laptop. It's not, I don't hide my laptop away. It's not like I don't even know how to do this, but can you put a password on a document? Sure. Yeah. These young people are like, yeah. But I don't do that either, and it just seems like I don't know, the secrecy sort of I haven't really worked out to what degree secrecy is even a part of this project.
When you revise your diary, are you revising because that doesn't sound good, or are you revising because you're like
I was a man that day. No. Do you mean do I actually change the events, or do I just change the prose? Well, no, not
change the events to make them fictional, but do you say when Leslie was saying that she goes back and she wished she'd put in more detail, do you go back and I forgot to mention this and this? So do you say and I did this, or you're more like to make it more polished to yourself?
I didn't even understand the scope of that question. Yeah, I guess you could sort of add things, but that's not that's not my tendency, because this book began life as like a perfectly reasonable 25,000 word book, and now it's an 8,000 word book. But no, and I just revised the prose for pleasure, for just the pleasure of having some good clean prose. Okay. I very seldom put more information in. I should say I'm very easily overwhelmed by the feeling of having too much. We were just talking about taking objects out of an apartment and putting them into boxes and sort of being just almost fainting at the hideous, overwhelming pile of boxes. Things like that cause me great anxiety. And so having too many words to work with is a constant low-level worry of mine. So, it just keeps getting shorter and shorter. More compact, I guess, is what I would say.
Okay, so then in terms of length, so the diary currently is like 800,000 words, and then the book about the diary is 20,000 words. So just how did that arrive at that? Like, what was your journey to find the right form to write about it? And I'm also interested in your journey to your book, because I think with both books, they didn't start out being what they ended up as. So just both of you just address that. But since you mentioned the length, do you want to go first, or do you want to
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I guess I had some kind of intention in the very beginning when I was writing a book about graphomania. I thought, well, of course, I'll show some. Example A. Here's a thing of here's like a short bit of graphomania for you to consume along with this essay. And as I pushed further into the subject, I realized that it would be really hard to choose like the best possible example. I mean, these are things that I worry about. So, if I were to excerpt the diary, which is like the most indulgent sort of thing to do, I guess. I thought it should be the best part of the diary, and then in order to determine the best part of the diary, I would have to reread the 800. It's more like almost 900,000 words of diary. And I didn't want to do it, and I was dragging my feet. And I asked my friends if I should do it, and they said, you should at least try. Like you should at least read it, a little bit of it. So as I say in the afterword, I'm giving the end away. I got on a plane with nothing to read except the diary, and I started reading the diary, and I got about 100,000 words in. And I had been excerpting all along what I thought were the best bits, and also in the afterword I say, I was dreaming that it would just become like 10 pages of a David Markson novel, just these wonderful, perfect, lapidary bits, and it was not like that, and I just in sort of nausea, I decided that I couldn't do it, but that I would write an afterword about why I didn't do it, and that eventually satisfied me, and it satisfied my editor Ethan, and happily that was the final form of the book. But I want to hear this story about how you wrote the book for Graywolf. It's so romantic. Isn't it kind of romantic?
Well, yeah, and I'm happy to talk a bit about the process of the book. Although what you were saying about the process of choosing not to excerpt the diary taps into one of the questions that I have had since the first time I read. I've read this book a few times, but the form of it is these sort of compact, little boxes of text or something on each page, and I'm wondering sort of how those took shape as units. Like, does each one have a little question burning inside of it, or was it sort of, because they connect, and there's something of a narrative. I mean, the narrative of becoming a mother runs through them, but they seem organized a lot by certain veins of wondering too, or something, but how they sort of took shape, and whether there were many more of them that never made it to the page, or
there is plenty of book that didn't make it into the book. As for putting them in order, this is a question that I got before about another narrative book that I wrote that was made up of small sections, sometimes less than a page. How did I put them in order? And the answer is really that I put them in order chronologically, but there's something wrong with me, so it doesn't read as chronological. But it really is the closest. It really is the closest that I could get to just a strictly chronological book. But you're right. I mean, there are these sort of asides where it sort of slides into pure philosophy, and it's nowhere in time. It's just this sort of almost like omniscient observer of all time. Maybe I don't do that much. I guess I hope I don't. But the order was really the series of decisions that I needed to make about the order of the book were the last things that needed to happen, and there was a lot of collaboration with my editor and with, I should have given it to you actually, but there a few writers whose wrestling with narrative made sense to me, and in the end, I didn't really feel that it was just me who was putting the book together.
Ethan says that during the editorial process that he would suggest, can you go in a little bit more here, but a little bit more there, and every time he did that, it got shorter.
It wasn't intentional.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because it seems like there are a couple of different narratives. I mean, there's the narrative of a family sort of building. I mean, a sort of a husband figure enters at a certain point, and then your son enters at another point. But there's also this narrative of sort of the compulsion to write down and what happens to that compulsion, or what it's almost like that compulsion is this character going through different evolutions across. But that feels like a kind of narrative, but it's not narrative in the sense of anecdotal happenings in space-time or something. It's like it's the fate of an impulse or the fate of a compulsion, which is a different kind of story than I had read. Yeah.
Well, it's also, can I interrupt you to talk about you for a second? There's I think my favorite part of your essay, The Grand Unified Theory of Female Pain, which I'm sure many in the audience know, is the point at which you distill, well, without saying I'm about to distill the entire project of autobiography into a very simple statement. What you say, the problem is that on one hand, I think, why does this shit always happen to me? And on the other hand, why can't I stop talking about this shit that keeps happening to me? And that's sort of like I don't know, a sort of digestible restatement of I think what I was trying to do in Ongoingness and what you were trying to describe. The fate of an impulse, though.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. That moment is it's quoted from an email that I sent to a friend I actually had dinner with last night. But I think when we were talking earlier about diary and sort of the project of writing for an audience or not quite being sure what audience you're writing for, I think that one thing that certainly came up for me in writing that final piece was I felt very much that I was writing towards and alongside many of the women in my life. And so I think it's no accident that I found the sort of clearest articulation of a dilemma in a letter that I was writing to a close friend. That somehow I felt some sense of both closeness with her, but also a need to make myself known to her somehow kind of came into vision for myself by expressing myself to her. But I think, elsewhere in the essay, I sort of crowdsourced to female friends and get their takes on things. And so I felt like somehow women speaking to each other was an important part of how certain concepts came into focus in that, which is a very different way for concepts to come into focus than like self-writing to self or other kinds of, I mean, in terms of how the empathy exams came into being, I do think it was really important. I mean, it was interesting to me what you said in the beginning about setting out to write a book about graphomania and then finding that you were writing a book about the sort of the end of graphomania or not experiencing that anymore. And I do, when the empathy exam started coming into being as a book for me, it did feel like something of a discovery that empathy was a through line, and I think it would have been a flatter and more limited, or at least for me and presumably for anybody who read it, a more unsatisfying project if it had sort of had empathy as its like guiding neon sign from the outset, because it was sort of more just like I wrote about what I felt like writing about. But really, the things that compel us, they do have connective tissue because we're just creatures in the world, and there are things that remain constant in us, and curiosities and hungers and things. And so it's sort of like I was obeying those hungers without putting a name to them, and then the process of collecting the pieces together was sort of shining a little flashlight on what some of that tissue looked like. Or
are you sitting there with either of you with burning questions for each other? Otherwise, I'll open it up. But if you do, you should. What would you feel like?
Is it all right to ask you about the book that you're working on now? Can you speak from sort of like in the middle of a form in the middle of a project?
Yeah, I was feeling a lot of. I am going to answer that question, but I'm going to answer it with a disclaimer about how badly I'm probably going to answer it. But when you were talking about how things always get shorter for you, I feel such intense jealousy, because I think I'm the opposite. I feel like things always get long. I've always tried to have an elevator pitch or something to be able to describe a project or a book, and it always takes like 10 sentences when it's supposed to take one. But yeah, it's how my mind bleeds out. But the book I'm working on right now is about addiction and recovery, and the ways that people make sense of the stories of their addiction, and kind of get through addiction by turning it into a story. And one of the stories in the book is my own story, but it's a book that is very explicitly sort of positioning my story in a kind of echo chamber alongside the stories of others. So I go into the archives and look at mainly writers who enter into recovery and try to think about how recovery changes the way they want to make art. There are also journalistic portions where I'm talking to people in recovery and kind of gathering their stories. And the hope is that all these stories have these kind of points of intersection that keep surprising me, and even some points of friction too, but sort of letting them speak to each other is the hope of the book, and trying to figure out the form of that is what I'm right in the midst of. But yeah,
I can't wait to read it, and it almost seems like the only way you can write one should write a narrative now. I mean, now that we all have permission to do it, right? You're sort of at once saying, there is a primary narrative, but there's literally no way I can just have a primary narrative, because there is an echo chamber. Like you can't extricate it from the entire conversation, the entire experience, especially when everybody knows how the story goes. You have an addiction, and then it stops. Like those events are just, that's it. I mean, they delimit it. And at the same time, there's a particularity of each one, and anyway, I have a feeling that this is going to make people think in a new way about narrative and not just addiction.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, and I think that so many of the issues that come out forcefully about narrative in the context of addiction and recovery sort of matter in ways that move beyond that sphere. So certainly that's the hope.
Any questions out there for either Leslie or Sarah?
Here's one right here. Let me go ahead and bring it in first. Do I need a mic? Just to the back of the room.
Okay. What I was going to ask, I'm sorry I haven't read you yet, Sarah, but I promise I will. When I read
accept that.
Your book, I was so astonished that it's a cliche. I could not stop reading it. I thought, and I mean, the language, the verbs, the sentence structure, the adjectives, I just thought, how did she put that sentence together? It's Mozartian. It's so gifted and so fresh that I immediately gave it the next day to my oldest friend. I said, put away anything you're reading. Read this, you must. And so I have a lame question for you, because you've been asked this so many times. How much rewriting do you do? How many drafts do you? It's because, of course, it jumps off the page. It's so spontaneous, and it's just amazing. But do you actually rewrite several times, or? It's a dumb question, but
it's not a dumb.
It's not
a dumb question at all. First of all, thank you for that, and especially in the context of what I was saying about that final essay. Caring a lot about the conversations that emerged between women, it felt really wonderful to hear that your first impulse was to give it to a friend, and to sort of feel like it could be part of more conversations between women or between
my
people
oldest
of any
friend
gender. Yeah.
who lives in the same building and is a woman.
Yeah.
I said, you must read this.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Put that down and read this.
I hope you were aggressive about it. Yeah. I try to be that way on a daily basis. Yeah. No, I mean, the answer is it varies a lot essay by essay, but I can how much I revise and how many drafts I do. But I can say that I actually tend to revise much more the pieces, the closer something is to my life, the more I revise it. So, which isn't to say I don't revise the more reported pieces, but that some of the reported pieces in the book, like the piece about Barkley, the ultramarathon in Tennessee, or the piece about Morgellons disease that we were talking about earlier, those much more emerges kind of intact in the first draft. I mean, I'm working from notes and all that, but the pieces that are about my life, I have to go back to over and over again, and rewriting, and what you were saying about revising your diary was making me think about that, because often it happens over the course of years, like where I'll write it and then a year later come back to it and need to say it a different way. And I think some of that is about breaking through the stories, or at least the stories I tell myself about my own life that have become kind of familiar and have become grooves, and the process of revising allows me to kind of break open that groove and find something trickier underneath it. So I think that's part of why revision almost feels more necessary and extended when it's personal material. So thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get one in the middle back there. Hi. I have a question for Fiona and also the writers. It is really notable that the nonfiction being published by Graywolf has done very well in the marketplace. And I find myself sometimes thinking, like with Citizen, and I sort of find myself thinking about whether the marketplace has changed, and there's kind of a gap that you guys are filling, or if it's that this kind of writing is kind of introducing a new appetite into the readership. So I'm just curious, because I just noticed over the last 10 or 20 years, the writing's changed, but maybe the marketplace has also changed.
I would say it's both, and that was a little bit in my question about Graywolf, like sort of like what's going on here, like what's in the water, and I still think in the some men haven't always been receptive to what our women writers are doing, but on the whole, I think there's much better reception for this, and the hybrid thing is, I think there's a wider acceptance now, and more people are seeing it do well. But internally, when we take these things on, we maybe I pretend that we know more than we do, but we don't necessarily know that these things are going to be sellers. And sometimes if we take on a rollicking good read on the fiction side that maybe isn't, I think on the back of your book it says you're shaping the contours of the contemporary essay, something like that on the back flat copy. And I feel like when that's what we like to think our books are doing, whether it's fiction, poetry, or non-fiction, in some way it's shaping the contour. But every now and again we publish a rollicking good read that's not necessarily doing that, and we think, well, maybe this will sell in the summer or something, and those books tend to kind of like do nothing. And it's all the ones where there's experiment and pushing the envelope. So I think there is more of a hunger, but really in a way it's you lot can answer that better than I can, and I certainly want to know what you two think about that.
I don't know. I don't have a very informed response. All I can say is that I just read things I like, and sometimes the things that everybody is reading, everybody is loving, I love, and sometimes they don't. Ferrante, yes. Knausgaard. I like. I read it. I liked it, but I don't know. I feel as if I'm utterly the wrong person to
Are you
talk
finding
about
that
the market.
there's more non-fiction essayistic stuff around for you to read than, say, there was 15 years ago?
I couldn't possibly answer accurately. I have no idea. I have no idea.
Can I ask you a question about sort of what it means for you, or how it feels for you to write now that you know that there are people out in the world who love your work? Like, I'm thinking about The Two Kinds of Decay, and I know that for me, and I know for a lot of other people, like, it's just a book that people have incredibly intense, powerful experiences with, and I'm sure you've gotten I mean, you sort of have some sense of those experiences, and whether you sort of think about that anonymous flock of people who sort of, whether they're present for you in any way when you write, or whether each piece is sort of headed out into the ether in a way that's not holding this, because you mention it in this book too, or sort of, it seems like you're sort of thinking about the project for that book, or how this one is different. And
well, it's kind of a nervy question, because I always feel that I'm fairly aware of how other people's books are being received, but I don't know, people kind of protect you from really knowing how your book is received, and I do. So my book, The Two Kinds of Decay, is about being chronically sick, and so when you write a book like that, and sort of make available part of yourself for this kind of conversation, other sick people write to you, and that is extraordinarily affirming. When somebody who's mortally sick writes and says, your book made things a little bit better, and if the point is to write things that keep people from committing suicide, then that is the highest affirmation that I could possibly receive. But that's sort of like anonymous throng. There's no anonymous throng of people who are like, buying my book. I mean, I've seen my sales. I'm not that writer, but I think I maybe do benefit very much, though, from individual people reaching out and saying, this book actually mattered to a human reader. And if I had to choose one or the other, I'd choose both. But but obviously the former is more validating.
Yeah. Well, and part of behind that question was the sense that the way that your writing engages with your own experience is exactly the kind of writing that, it does produce that feeling. I'm sure, I know with your first book, but I also feel like with this book, there's I don't know, I've been thinking about this and trying to write about this, but there's a different kind of intimacy that I think is created between a writer and a reader in Ongoingness than, the way you put it, the part of yourself that you share in The Two Kinds of Decay is, there's something corporeal and very powerful about it. But here, it's like the sense of readers being invited inside kind of reckoning, which is also a really intimate space. It's just a different sort of, it's a different part of the self to offer.
That, I just want to say, that's a really intelligent description of the book. And if you were wondering what it was about, that's what it is about.
I can offer the short version of yours, but not my own. So anyway.
Wonderful. We are just about out of time for the evening. On behalf of the Strand, I wanted to thank Leslie, Sarah, and Fiona for joining us tonight. So let's give them a round of applause.